Hello, I'm Pastor Horace Douty in Lexington, Virginia, and each Sunday I bring you a sermon, a Bible meditation by way of YouTube. And I encourage you to subscribe to Horace Douty YouTube, D-O-U-T-Y, and share these meditations with your family and with your friends. I appreciate that. Today, the title of the meditation is God is Optimistic. It's based on the parable of the sower, where Jesus tells the gardener sows seed on certain kinds of soil. And the parable is a favorite of the gardeners because a lot of people are gardeners and they understand about making things grow. Most preachers delight in pointing how the church is full of the three kinds of poor soil and how Jesus wants most of us to be the fourth kind, the good kind. And there is truth in several interpretations, but I believe that basically the parable has two thrusts. One is pessimistic and the other is optimistic. The odds against Christ and His church. Only one of four soils is productive. And there is in this parable a tinge of pessimism. But the other approach is optimistic. The parable carries a ringing assurance for faint-hearted disciples, which most of us are. Because the parable says, in spite of all failures, God's work gets done and His harvest yields beyond all estimation. There is profitable power in faith. Jesus told this story midstream in His career. The first flush of His success, when the enthusiastic crowds greeted Him wherever He went, had faded. And now there's growing opposition, misunderstanding. The atmosphere was permeated by doubt, very similar to what we have today. And Jesus continued preaching optimistic sermons, but that undergirding optimism did not go everywhere. There were people who were pessimistic and still are. Consider the parallel passage in the Old Testament in Isaiah, the prophet of the exile. He speaks in God's behalf. So shall my message be that goes forth from my mouth. It shall not return to me empty. It shall accomplish that which I purpose and prosper in the thing for which I sent it. That's a statement from God according to the Bible. Optimism with respect to God's purpose for the world at what seemed to be a hopeless situation at the end of 50 long years of exile in Babylon. Almost everybody had given up any hope of deliverance. God was either dead or impotent, and yet God said, my word will not return to me empty. We are aware of the current pessimism in the literature and in the churches that Christianity, religion of any kind, is in retreat. There's very little power in faith. It cuts little ice where decisions that count are made. We know that thousands of people are not turned on with religion or Christianity. And we also know that curious new cults spring up like crocus in the springtime. And we might call this a reasonably pessimistic time for the church. But there is the incredible and determined optimism of God. Despite the obvious failures of the church, God does not fail to sow the seed anyway. And he sows the seed with more than hopefulness. He sows it with the certainty that his message will prevail. His purpose will be achieved. God is not a worrier. He may not be pleased with everything that we're doing and not doing, but he's not worried. My message will not return to me empty, he said. Now this probably accounts for the divine carelessness of God sowing bountiful seed everywhere, even in places where it has very little chance of growing. And we try to measure the results of God's work in our world, which probably is a ridiculous waste of time, because we've got all kinds of yardsticks to measure what's going right and what's going wrong. And yet, even when 3/4 of the soil is barren, God's will gets done. You know that by now, I do not put much trust in the figures that seem so obvious, that the church is losing ground. Very few people are joining or being educated for the ministry. And it makes me think of Jesus. He chose 12 of the best, I presume the best he could find, and they all forsook him and fled, although John says I was there. But Jesus Christ prayed earnestly before choosing each disciple. Have you ever considered how could Judas be the answer to a prayer? It's a good question. And if God used our calculations to assess tangible results, then there would be no prophets. There would be no Christ, no church, no Bible, no offer of love and forgiveness. And that's what it all adds up to in the end. The embarrassing fact that God is utterly and completely optimistic about you and in me. I suspect that if God were not so clearly and divinely generous with his word, his seed, if he were more calculating, he'd give up on us. But the point of the good soil is that in each one of you there is the potential for growth, for response. And that potential is not off somewhere in somebody else. It is in you. You. Of course it's unsettling, this confidence that God has in you, certain that you can respond and bring forth fruit 100-fold. And Jesus ended this story with, "He who has ears, let him hear." We're not spectators. We're in that story. All of those unproductive soils are part of us in our makeup. There's a beaten path. Harden my years of daily grind. There's a shallow ground, the superficial enthusiasm of the moment. But enthusiasm burns out when we come up against people who are not willing to share our ideas, our inspiration. But there is also good soil right there. The riches and the pleasures of this life sometimes go so well that we don't feel any need for God. And the results are the same. The divine message is choked to death. But there is good soil in you and in me, every one of us. There's the urge within you to respond, and the desire and the ability, the yearning for the deep peace of God, even in the midst of care and anxieties, and the riches and the pleasures. And God, optimistic as he is confident you will respond. He knows you can bear fruit 100-fold. God is no dreamer. God knows. And he says, he who has ears to hear, listen and hear. Amen. God bless you all.